Here are 45 neighbor wars that got so out of hand. They make family feuds look like friendly disagreements. 1. A man became convinced his neighbor was stealing his morning newspaper, so he set up 17 security cameras around his front yard and began timing his neighbor's every movement with military precision. After 6 months of surveillance, he discovered the newspaper delivery person had been consistently throwing his paper into the wrong yard. He never apologized to his neighbor and kept all the cameras up, just in case. 2. Two neighbors got into a dispute over a property line that was literally 6 inches wide. What started as a polite conversation escalated into a 5-year legal battle costing both families over $50,000 in lawyer fees. They ultimately spent more money fighting over 6 inches of land than the entire property was worth, and the legal battle outlasted both of their marriages. 3. A woman became furious when her neighbor's oak tree dropped leaves in her yard every fall. Instead of raking them or talking to her neighbor, she spent 3 years collecting every single leaf, bagging them, and dumping them back on her neighbor's doorstep with passive-aggressive notes about returning your property. The neighbor retaliated by planting 6 more oak trees along the property line. 4. A man decided his neighbor's dog barked too much, so he built a 12-foot-tall wall between their properties made entirely of car tires, painted bright orange. The wall was so hideous and violated so many city codes that it became a local tourist attraction, with people driving by just to take photos of the tire wall of spite. Both neighbors ended up selling their houses at a loss. 5. Two neighbors got into an escalating Christmas decoration war that lasted 15 years. It started with competing light displays and evolved into massive inflatable decorations, hired professional installers, and electricity bills that rivaled small businesses. The final year included a 40-foot inflatable Santa that required city permits and attracted so much traffic that police had to set up roadblocks during December. 6. A neighbor became obsessed with the fact that his neighbor's fence was allegedly 2 inches over the property line. He hired 3 different surveyors, filed 14 complaints with the city, and built his own fence exactly 2 inches away from the disputed fence, creating the world's narrowest corridor between 2 properties, where nothing could fit except angry letters and small animals. 7. A woman decided her neighbor's lawn was too perfect and made her own yard look bad by comparison. She began sneaking over at night to spray weed killer in random patterns, creating mysterious dead spots in the pristine grass. When confronted, she claimed it was natural lawn disease and offered to help find a landscaper. The neighbor installed motion sensor lights, turning nighttime into a suburban light show every time a cat walked by. 8. Two neighbors got into a dispute over snow removal that escalated into what local news called the Great Snowplow War of 2019. Each winter, they would hire competing snow removal services and explicitly instruct them to pile all the snow on the other neighbor's property. By February, there were 15-foot snow walls separating their driveways, and both families had to park 3 blocks away because their own driveways were inaccessible. 9. A man became convinced his neighbor was spying on him through their shared fence. So he built a second fence 3 feet taller, right next to the first one. The neighbor responded by installing a periscope on a pole to see over both fences. This escalated into an arms race of increasingly tall surveillance equipment, until both yards looked like military installations, and confused delivery drivers regularly got lost trying to find their front doors. 10. A woman discovered her neighbor had been using her Wi-Fi for 2 years and decided revenge was more satisfying than simply changing the password. She renamed her network to Your Neighbor Knows You Steal Wi-Fi and set up a guest network called Pay for Your Own Internet. The neighbor retaliated by setting up speakers facing her house and playing the dial-up internet sound on repeat for 8 hours every day. 11. Two neighbors fought over a shared driveway for so long that they both forgot who actually owned it. Each installed their own security gates, creating a situation where neither could access their own garages without climbing over or around multiple barriers. They lived like this for 3 years, both too stubborn to back down, until a postal worker got trapped between the gates and the fire department had to cut them both open. 12. A man became enraged that his neighbor's basketball hoop was 6 inches on his side of the property line. Instead of asking them to move it, he built a 20-foot-tall wooden wall directly behind the basketball hoop, making it impossible to retrieve any missed shots. The neighbor's kids adapted by only shooting from the other direction, which meant basketballs constantly landed in a different neighbor's yard, expanding the conflict to 3 households. 13. A woman decided her neighbor's garden gnomes were looking at her inappropriately and demanded they be removed or turned around. When the neighbor refused, she began a campaign of gnome warfare, placing increasingly larger lawn ornaments in her own yard, positioned to stare back at the offending gnomes. The situation escalated until both yards contained life-size statues, engaged in what appeared to be an eternal staring contest. 14. 2 neighbors got into a feud over parking spaces on their shared private road. Each began blocking the other's car with increasingly creative obstacles, starting with traffic cones and eventually progressing to parked motorcycles, strategically placed flower pots, and a full-sized boat trailer. The situation reached peak absurdity when one neighbor hired a food truck to park permanently in front of the other's driveway. 15. A man became obsessed with his neighbor's wind chimes, claiming they were too loud and interfered with his sleep. He responded by installing a sound system that played recordings of construction noise every time the wind chimes made any sound. This created a feedback loop where natural wind would trigger artificial jackhammer sounds, making their quiet suburban street sound like a 24-hour construction zone. 16. A woman discovered her neighbor had been stealing packages from her front porch, so she began ordering increasingly bizarre items with the specific goal of confusing the thief. The packages progressed from fake dog poop to live crickets to adult diapers with personalized messages. The neighbor continued stealing packages even after receiving a box containing 50 pounds of glitter and a note that said, "Hope this was worth it." 17. 2 neighbors fought over the exact placement of their shared mailbox for 6 months, each moving it a few inches every night when the other wasn't looking. The mailbox ended up traveling nearly 30 feet back and forth along their street before the Postal Service declared the entire situation a hazard and refused to deliver mail to either address until they figured it out like adults. 18. A man decided his neighbor's cat was trespassing in his yard, so he built an elaborate obstacle course designed to discourage feline visitors. The setup included motion-activated sprinklers, aluminum foil pathways, and small speakers playing recordings of barking dogs. The cat learned to navigate the entire system like a furry ninja, and videos of its daily obstacle course runs went viral on social media. 19. A neighbor became convinced that his neighbor's security cameras were pointed at his hot tub, so he built a 15-foot-tall privacy screen made entirely of old doors and windows collected from garage sales. The bizarre wall looked like a reject from a post-apocalyptic movie set and created wind tunnels that blew everyone's trash into a third neighbor's yard, expanding the conflict and creating the neighborhood's first 3-way property dispute. 20. 2 women got into an escalating flower garden competition that started friendly and ended with hired landscapers, imported soil, and professional garden designers on retainer. Each spring brought bigger displays, more exotic plants, and higher maintenance costs. The competition finally ended when both neighbors went bankrupt, trying to outgarden each other, and had to sell their houses to pay for landscaping bills. 21. A man decided his neighbor's outdoor decorations were culturally insensitive to his own heritage and demanded they be removed. When diplomacy failed, he began his own decoration campaign featuring increasingly elaborate displays celebrating his own culture. The situation escalated until both yards looked like competing ethnic festivals, complete with flags, statues, and traditional music playing from outdoor speakers at maximum volume. 22. A neighbor became obsessed with the fact that his neighbor's trash cans were 3 inches closer to his property than to their own house. He began measuring the distance daily with a tape measure and filing weekly complaints with city code enforcement. When the measurements proved the cans were legally placed, he built a small fence around his entire yard, specifically designed to prevent the visual intrusion of seeing his neighbor's garbage containers. 23. Two neighbors fought over a mature apple tree that sat exactly on their property line. Instead of sharing the apples or coming to a reasonable agreement, each began harvesting only the apples on their side of the tree. This led to the installation of a net down the middle of the tree, creating what looked like a vertical tennis court for fruit. Both neighbors ended up spending more money on legal fees and tree modification than the apples were worth. 24. A woman became convinced her neighbor was deliberately timing their lawn mowing to interfere with her outdoor meditation sessions. She responded by scheduling her own lawn care to occur during what she had determined were her neighbor's quiet hours. This created a suburban arms race of passive-aggressive lawn maintenance that turned every day into a symphony of competing lawnmowers and leaf blowers. 25. A man decided his neighbor's outdoor lighting was too bright and installed his own floodlights pointed directly at their bedroom windows in retaliation. The neighbor responded with even brighter lights, creating an escalating illumination war that turned their corner of the neighborhood into what local police described as brighter than a football stadium at midnight. Both families ended up wearing sleep masks and blackout curtains year-round. 26. Two neighbors got into a dispute over whose responsibility it was to maintain a shared retaining wall. Instead of splitting the cost, each built their own wall on their side of the property line, creating a double wall system that looked like border fortification between two hostile nations. The gap between the walls became a no man's land, where weeds grew wild and small animals took up residence. 27. A neighbor became furious that his neighbor's children were too loud when playing in their own backyard. He responded by setting up speakers that played classical music at high volume whenever he heard children's voices, claiming it was educational noise pollution. The children adapted by timing their outdoor play to coincide with the music, essentially turning their backyard into a daily dance party that attracted other neighborhood kids. 28. A woman decided her neighbor's choice of exterior house paint was lowering her own property values. She began a campaign of leaving paint swatches and color magazines on their doorstep with passive-aggressive notes about community aesthetics. When this failed to produce results, she hired a professional painter to give her neighbor a free estimate, claiming it was a neighborhood beautification initiative. 29. Two neighbors fought over snow removal responsibilities for their shared sidewalk, each shoveling only exactly half of their designated section. This created a zigzag pattern of cleared and uncleared walkway that was more dangerous than leaving the entire sidewalk covered in snow. Pedestrians had to navigate what looked like a winter obstacle course, and the mailman began delivering mail only on days when the weather was clear. 30. A man became obsessed with his neighbor's rain gutter system, claiming that water runoff was damaging his foundation. He installed an elaborate system of tarps, gutters, and drainage pipes designed to redirect all water back onto his neighbor's property. The resulting Rube Goldberg contraption was so complex that it required daily maintenance and actually created more water problems than it solved. 31. A neighbor decided that his neighbor's bird feeders were attracting too many birds to the area, so he installed a scarecrow specifically positioned to frighten away any birds that might land in his own yard. The neighbor responded by adding more bird feeders and building a small bird sanctuary. The result was a bizarre ecosystem, where one yard was a bird paradise and the adjacent yard looked like a horror movie set designed to terrorize wildlife. 32. Two women got into an escalating holiday decoration war that extended beyond Christmas to include every possible holiday, no matter how obscure. Their yards became rotating seasonal displays featuring everything from inflatable Valentine's hearts to elaborate Halloween graveyards to massive 4th of July fireworks displays. Neighbors began organizing viewing parties to watch each seasonal transition, and the local newspaper started running a monthly feature covering their latest decorative developments. 33. A man became convinced his neighbor was stealing his morning deliveries, so he installed a fake package containing a GPS tracker and filled with glitter. When the package disappeared and the tracker showed it moving around his neighbor's house, he called police to report the theft. It turned out his own dog had been dragging packages through a hole in the fence and burying them in the neighbor's flower garden. 34. A neighbor decided that his neighbor's outdoor exercise routine was too distracting and filed noise complaints about rhythmic thumping during morning workouts. The exercising neighbor moved their routine to comply with noise ordinances, but the complaining neighbor then filed additional complaints about visual disruption caused by seeing someone exercise through the window. The dispute ended only when the exercising neighbor installed one-way mirror film on all their windows. 35. Two neighbors fought over the exact boundary of their shared fence line for so long that they both hired separate contractors to build new fences. This resulted in two complete fence systems running parallel to each other, with a 3-foot gap between them that became a sort of no man's land. Local children began using the corridor as a shortcut to school, and it eventually became an unofficial neighborhood pathway that neither neighbor could control. 36. A woman became furious that her neighbor's vegetable garden was more successful than her own, and began researching ways to sabotage it without getting caught. Her methods escalated from subtle water theft to strategic shade creation, using tarps and umbrellas positioned to block sunlight from reaching the prize-winning tomatoes. The neighbor installed time-lapse cameras and caught the entire sabotage operation on film, which became evidence in what local prosecutors called the most ridiculous agricultural crime of the year. 37. A man decided his neighbor's choice of lawn ornaments was inappropriate for the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. He began a campaign of leaving anonymous notes critiquing each decoration's artistic merit and suggesting improvements to the overall yard design. When the notes were ignored, he started his own competing lawn display featuring what he considered superior artistic choices, creating dueling art installations that confused visitors and made both yards look like outdoor modern art galleries. 38. Two neighbors got into a dispute over whose dog was barking too much, despite the fact that both dogs barked equally often. Each began keeping detailed logs of the other dog's barking schedule and filing competing noise complaints with animal control. The situation escalated until both neighbors were recording 24-hour audio surveillance of each other's yards, creating what local mediators described as mutual canine espionage. 39. A neighbor became obsessed with the fact that his neighbor's driveway drainage caused water to flow toward his property during heavy rains. He installed an elaborate system of berms, trenches, and water redirects that turned his yard into what looked like a miniature flood control project. The engineering was so complex that city inspectors had to be called in to determine whether it violated any municipal water management codes. 40. A woman decided her neighbor's outdoor furniture placement was blocking her view of the sunset and began a systematic campaign to document the view obstruction with daily photographs taken from multiple angles. She compiled these into presentations for the city council, claiming that furniture placement constituted a zoning violation. The neighbor responded by rearranging their furniture daily, creating what became known as the sunset chair shuffle. 41. Two neighbors fought over leaf cleanup responsibilities for a large tree that sat exactly on their property line. Each raked only the leaves that fell on their side, creating a sharp line of raked and unraked leaves that looked like someone had drawn a boundary with foliage. The visual effect was so striking that it attracted attention from landscaping professionals who used it as an example of what not to do in property maintenance. 42. A man became convinced that his neighbor's Wi-Fi network name was a personal insult directed at him, despite the fact that it was just a generic router default name. He began changing his own network name daily to include increasingly creative responses to the perceived insult. The Wi-Fi war escalated until both neighbors were spending hours daily updating network names, creating a constantly changing digital conversation that confused anyone trying to connect to internet in the area. 43. A neighbor decided that his neighbor's choice of outdoor music was inappropriate and began playing competing music from his own speakers at the same time. This created a daily battle of the bands where each side tried to drown out the other's music selections. The resulting acoustic chaos was so disruptive that other neighbors began wearing headphones outdoors, and local noise ordinances had to be updated to address competitive audio pollution. 44. Two women got into an escalating competition over who had the most perfectly maintained lawn, each hiring professional services to outdo the other's grass care routine. The competition became so intense that both lawns required daily maintenance, specialized equipment, and fertilization schedules that would have impressed professional golf course managers. The rivalry finally ended when both neighbors realized they were spending more on lawn care than on their mortgages. 45. And finally, the most spectacularly petty neighbor war of all time. A man became so enraged by his neighbor's habit of parking 6 inches over an unmarked property line that he spent $25,000 building a mechanical car lift in his driveway. Every time his neighbor parked in the disputed area, he would use the lift to pick up his own car and place it directly on top of his neighbor's vehicle, creating an automotive parking sandwich. The local fire department had to invest in specialized equipment just to handle the weekly calls about vertically stacked vehicles, and both neighbors were eventually arrested for creating a public safety hazard. These neighbor wars prove that sometimes the biggest threats to peaceful suburban living aren't crime or natural disasters. They're the people living 20 feet away who have decided that 6 inches of property line is worth destroying their own quality of life to defend. Each one of these conflicts demonstrates how ordinary people can transform minor disagreements into legendary feuds that become